Okay, I think we'll wait a few more minutes before we begin. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Okay, it's just about 3 o'clock, so I think we'll begin. Thank you all again for joining. My name is Deborah Tollefson, and I'm a professor of philosophy here at the University of Memphis and director of the Technology Serving Humanity Speaker Series. This is a new public lecture series launched by the U of M FedEx Institute of Technology. It focuses on the social, political, legal, ethical, and philosophical aspects of technology with the aim of broadening our understanding of technology's impacts. National and international scholars from the humanities, fine arts, communication, and the social sciences joined us this year. And you can find more out about the series at the FedEx Institute of Technology website. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Andrew Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson is a professor of law at the American University Washington College of Law. He researches and writes in the area of criminal procedure, evidence, and criminal justice technologies. He's a national expert on predictive policing, big data surveillance, and criminal justice technologies. He's big data surveillance, juries, and the Fourth Amendment. His articles have appeared in the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, the California Law Review, the Cornell Law Review, Vanderbilt Law Review, Iowa Law Review, and the Notre Dame Law Review, among many others. Professor Ferguson's book, The Rise of Big Data Policing, Surveillance, Race, and the Future of Law Enforcement, was published in 2017, and it examines how surveillance technology and predictive analytics shapes modern policing. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ferguson.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here and do a little slide work here. Make sure that works. Yeah, thumbs up if you can see that, right? You see that?
Yep, looks good.
All right. So thank you very much for having me. It is an honor to be here to talk about my latest article called Surveillance and the Tyrant Test. It is what I see as sort of a coda to my book, sort of a bookend to a book about how big data policing technologies are changing policing, changing where police go, how they investigate, who they target, and really changing the power dynamics between the individuals who are being policed and the police. And so this article situates some of the challenges, some of the ways of thinking about how new police technologies, new surveillance technologies are changing America. Just a little bit about me. I am a law professor, as you heard, as a former public defender in DC. And I sort of see my job now as trying to figure out how new technologies intersect really old law. Because a lot of the law we're dealing with is not just antiquated from the 1980s and 1990s, but really we're going back to the Constitution. And so how do we fit these constitutional principles into these new technologies that were clearly not envisioned by our founding, but are actually part of who we are as America? It seems like a perfect jumping off point to talk about humanity and technology and the role. So I want to talk to you about this paper that really talks about a fundamental question of what do we do with these superpowers we're giving police? Because we're literally giving them the powers to see through homes, to listen to our conversations, to watch us all at all times. The role of technology is changing our sort of sense of privacy, our sense of security, our ways of interacting, some of our First Amendment freedoms. And we need to think about what are the first principles to approach these new, kind of somewhat scary technologies. So I want to begin with a story about facial recognition technology. Now, you all probably heard about facial recognition technology. It is essentially the ability to take a sort of digital map of your face and match it with a digital map of your face that's been recorded in a database of faces. You might have heard about how it's being rolled out in countries like in China, where literally in order to shame jaywalkers, someone's walking down the street and a big picture, a digital picture of them, the shamed jaywalker, is posted next to them to show in real time that they're watching and they can see you. It's just a digital match, but it's obviously quite powerful. You may also have read about it in the sort of prosecutions of the January 6th insurrection. The FBI and other law enforcement is using facial recognition right now to prosecute those individuals who were charged with going into the Capitol. So my story begins as I am testifying before Congress on Capitol Hill before the House Oversight Committee about facial recognition. It was the first of a series of hearings on facial recognition of what should happen. And on my left, my political right, but on my left, we have some of the most conservative congresspeople in America. We have this idea, Jim Jordan is taking off his jacket and yelling about the dangers of facial recognition. We have other conservative judges, conservative congresspeople who are worried about facial recognition being used to figure out whether they're going to the gun range or to the church. And then on my right, but my political left, I have AOC and some of the most progressive of Congress people in America who are also railing against the dangers of facial recognition. And as I'm sitting there, myself, somewhat of a progressive person, I thought something's gonna happen. We're gonna move forward on this technology because lo and behold, in a Congress that's otherwise dysfunctional, we have agreement on the right and the left and seemingly in the center to do something. And what happened? Nothing. Nothing's happened. It's been 3 years and nothing has happened. Why has nothing happened? Well, that's the centerpiece of this article. What are the forces that are at play that have frustrated our ability to move forward on first principles? Because the reality is what happened was any attempt to regulate facial recognition was frustrated by people on the sort of abolitionist side that really thought no facial recognition technology should be allowed. Was also frustrated on the law enforcement side that said any regulation of facial recognition will thwart our ability to solve crimes. And in this sort of inability to move forward, those who wanted to relegate were attacked from both sides and nothing has happened. And yet, as I say, nothing has happened. That's not really true, because facial recognition technology has moved forward. It has moved apace beyond what we had seen 3 years ago. And doing nothing, in many ways, is doing something with this dystopian power. So I want to just talk briefly about the technologies at issue when we think about what are these first principles to deal with these superpowers. What are we talking about when we're talking about a need for technologies to be regulated, to be banned? Why should we care? So I talked a bit about facial recognition. I'm going to go into that. I'm going to talk about persistent surveillance planes that have been flying over Baltimore. I'm going to talk about smart sensors and video analytics. And I will note, having done a quick Google search, many of these, or some of these, are actually in Memphis. And so after this, you can go ask yourself some questions about whether you know what kind of technologies are being used in Memphis and other places, and whether you're comfortable with police using these technologies, or whether you would hope there might be some regulation or some limitation, or maybe you're okay with it, and that's what we're going to talk about. So briefly, facial recognition. You should realize that facial recognition is being used right now. Literally right now. There are 42 federal agencies that use it on a somewhat regular basis. The FBI relies on it in a growing way. The New York Police Department relies on it in a growing way. And there is essentially no regulation on it. We have found that the technologies are being used, but we're not really sure exactly how, because again, there's no need for transparency or no forcing mechanisms for audits. We've done some tests of the technology itself, but not really how it's always being used in police. with just a few exceptions of the GAO and a couple other places have looked at it, which is how we know that there are 42 government agencies using facial recognition, but we don't really know in any granular way how it's being rolled out. We also know that the technology exists, although to my knowledge is not being used in real time. So there are camera systems in Memphis and other places that have video sensors where the facial image can be taken. You could take a still of the photo and combine it with a data set and match it to someone there. But you also could do that in real time. My understanding is in America, although not in China, in America, we have not reached the point where we're rolling out that kind of facial recognition, but the technology exists. And it's a superpower of sorts, meaning that you might not be able to go to that church or that gun range or that political rally or that protest without being identified by a technology that could be used. We also have some rogue technologies like Clearview Ai is a private company that basically scraped the internet for over 100 billion images of your face and mine, and has sort of put into a search engine where you can literally just put in a face and pretty much be fairly confident that you'll get something close to your face in all of those Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, wherever you've been putting your face on the web. They have it and they can use it. So that's facial recognition. We also have something like persistent surveillance system. Let me take you to Baltimore. Last year in Baltimore, Maryland, there were planes flying over Baltimore that had amazingly elaborate camera systems. And these camera systems could record essentially the city of Baltimore and all the people in the city of Baltimore going about their daily business. The images would take about a photo a minute, but they could be stitched together so you could go back in time. They literally advertised it kind of like a TiVo, but for surveillance, where you could just roll back the tape to see what was going on. And in that capacity, they were then partnering with the Baltimore Police Department in this pilot project. So when there was a crime, like imagine there's a bank robbery. Bank robbery is at 4th and Elm at 12 o'clock. Well, the camera has caught that along with everything else. And you can go back to the bank. Oh, there's a bank. You can see the getaway car. Oh, there's a getaway car. You can see how the getaway car goes to a different car. You always got to have another car to change up your plans. But you get to the second car, and then you watch the people end up at their grandma's house or wherever it was. An amazingly powerful tool of surveillance. Now, the downside, of course, is it captured everyone in Baltimore. People going to church, people protesting the police, people who just were going about their daily business and didn't particularly want to be surveilled by the Baltimore Police Department. And this technology came to be because there was a sort of grant given by John Arnold, the billionaire, to try this out. And Baltimore police and the city wanted to try it out. And it went pretty far until there was a lawsuit brought by a community group in the ACLU that basically said this violated the Fourth Amendment, went through some litigation. And last summer, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals en banc said that it did violate the Fourth Amendment and that those kinds of cases will continue in the courts. But again, superpower, literally a time machine to go back and see what happened in a city all the way through the time. Again, there were 12-hour spots. They didn't see it at night, which is kind of weird for a crime detecting thing. But anyway, a few gaps. And connected with things like automated license plate readers, other kinds of street-level cameras. So you really could patch together a pretty powerful surveillance web. Again, a superpower. And a question of, what do you do with this? Do you regulate it? Do you ban it? Do you just trust that the police will use it okay? What should you do with this newfound power? Same thing with smart sensors. Right now, in many cities, we are seeing the development of the precursors to smart cities. Maybe you'll see it in a smart streetlight, or maybe you'll see it in ShotSpotter technology. ShotSpotter technology is an audio sensor device that picks up gunshots. It's in Memphis right now. And essentially what it is a triangulation of an audio sound of a gunshot that sends police to the area when the gunshot sounds. Kind of makes sense, right? There's a gunshot, you can get there quicker if you have this technology. Now, the way it works, of course, is it means that there are little money microphones in your city listening to you. Can also pick up your conversation, so they try not to. And they also have other capabilities. In one place, they decide, well, wouldn't it be more efficient if we had drones fly to the sound of the gunshot? Because drones will get there faster than police, and we'll put some cameras on the drones, and we'll have a more effective system. Again, For law enforcement, wow, pretty powerful. It's kind of like a superpower. You can get there immediately and take pictures of what's going on. For people in the community, it might be, wow, that's kind of scary that there are now drones with cameras flying every time they hear a loud sound. And that's some of the challenge of what do you do with this? It's useful for tracking. It's useful for being able to see what happens in particular patterns. And these sensors are now being built into our sort of environment. They're literally in the smart streetlights. They can be built into curbs. And as we get into autonomous cars, we're going to need more of these sensors, which will track us where we go and what we do and all of those things. It's a huge power. It's a potentially beneficial power. You kind of want streetlights to be smart, not waste electricity when you don't need them. You kind of want cars to be smart if we're going to rely on them to drive in an autonomous way. But every one of those technological changes is also, of course, a surveillance enhancement for police who might want to use it for the solving of crimes or whatever it would be. All right, final just example of what we're talking about, video analytics. To me, it's the one that is not given the same due as everyone else, although I think it's actually as scary as facial recognition. We have the ability to link cameras and do what's called object recognition within the cameras. What does that mean? It means that in Chicago right now, there are 30,000 linked cameras in downtown Chicago where they can watch you go street to street, area to area. In New York City, almost all of Lower Manhattan is observed through what's called a domain awareness system, which is, again, a series of cameras with other kinds of sensors coming in that allows police to watch what's going on in Lower Manhattan. Now, the interesting thing about these camera systems, they're not just watching. They're also giving you the same time machine power that you had in the persistent surveillance plans. Why? Because object recognition basically is like, I can find a particular thing in all of this data there, right? So you can type in, I want to find all the people wearing a red jersey that says, wherever, Indiana, with the Indiana logo, and find it in New York City. And like, if it's in the camera, if you can get the pattern recognition, they can find all the people with red shirts or red sweatshirts, and then maybe even find all the people with the I or Indiana, whatever it would be, that would be able to locate. And they can break it down. So it is a sort of series of images that you literally can see, oh, at this particular time and date, I saw this red sweatshirt. Oh, and this one too. And you really can play with time in a whole new way to be able to see the world through objects in different ways. You can do patterns and pathways and activities, and all of it, of course, is a superpower that probably begs the question, or should encourage the question of, well, what do we do with this? Like, what on earth do we do? How does society control this potentially liberty-destroying technology that's also kind of useful for law enforcement? We're giving law enforcement superpowers, which they want, because, of course, they can use those to potentially help us out in other ways. So the fundamental question that sits at the core of this paper is, what do we do with these technologies? Do we just panic and ban them all? Do we say, I don't know, they seem kind of helpful, so we'll just let them go, trust the police and go this way? Or do we try to regulate them, and in regulating them, what are our sort of guidelines to think about it? Or do we come up with something else? And so the article sets out the 4 approaches that we as society have taken already, and examines them critically, both to show their limitations and then tries to tease from them a way forward. And I call them, in my own sort of taxonomy of this stuff, the trust lens, which is basically trust the police, the trap lens, which is more of an abolitionist idea of it's all a trap, don't trust the police, and then a technocratic lens, the idea of like, well, maybe we can regulate our way out of this in smart ways. And then I show in the article that those all fail for different reasons, which we'll get into, and that we need to try something new, which I call my Tyrant Test. These are questions that are interesting to write about in a law review article, but they're fundamental to like your world now. Like, as you sit here today listening to me, ask yourself, what technologies do police have in my community? And if you don't know the answer, which you may not, where would you go to find that answer? And what's striking is both questions are largely unanswerable in most jurisdictions. We don't know what technologies police are using, and we don't even know where to go because we don't have these structures of accountability set up in our system. So I'm going to talk about how we got there and some of the problems with how we got there. So I begin with what I call the trust lens. So the trust lens is basically this idea of, well, let's just trust the police. We trust them in a whole host of other ways. Surveillance technology is just another tool. And so we can figure out what happens. And this is honestly the dominant form of accountability, if that's accountability, in America today. We have a system that essentially trusts police for a whole series of possibly very good reasons that are worth exploring. One is sort of tradition. We've always done, right? You look around about the police accountability mechanisms in most cities, and like you might have a oversight board for egregious situations, but you don't actually have a whole lot of community involvement in like the governing of police. We traditionally let police do their own things. They are a professional entity. They have their own academies where they train. And there's a sort of level of expertise that has given a deference to them to say, well, you do the policing things. And if part of that is surveillance, okay, we're okay with that. And that's generally been the approach that society has taken in most jurisdictions. Some of it, of course, is tactical, right? If you're doing a surveillance technology, you don't necessarily want to advertise to the world, because if part of its sort of power is not just deterrence, but actually catching people, you don't want to tell people where the surveillance is, because then they're not going to do what you think they're going to do in front of the surveillance. So there's a tactical argument about why police should just be trusted with this. There's a capacity issue. Like, who really is going to challenge it? Who's going to watch your jurisdiction? Like, what institution, what entity has the power and capacity to be able to figure out whether this type of facial recognition is the type we should use or not, or whether there's a better one, or what are the error rates, or all this. You got to have someone to do that in order to do it. And our default has been, well, we don't have those people, so I guess we got to trust the police. Political power, like police have political power in many jurisdictions. We've seen it more and more. New York City is a great object lesson of what's going on with political power, where a mayor who's enamored by police technology, it keeps moving forward. And we'll see how that plays out. But the politics of policing and political votes is pretty strong. That has led to a lack of oversight around surveillance technologies. And then there's a reality of procurement. Like, no one cares about police procurement. It's boring, right? We don't care about how many radios you get or how many cars you buy. And so why do we care if you bought the next edition of ShotSpotter with your budget or facial recognition? Like, we do care, but in a procurement battle, we're not paying attention. And in many of these situations, the technology was purchased without a whole lot of oversight or awareness of what was going on. So what was the result of this trust lens? Honestly, it's been largely a failure. It's been a series of scandals, a series of embarrassments, a series of problematic stories. I'll just talk about two. One focuses on the laser program out of LA and LAPD. The other is the strategic subjects list out of Chicago. Both were early iterations of predictive policing that largely failed. Here's what happened with laser. Laser stands for the LA Strategic Extraction and Restoration Unit. That it was sort of pitched as, and this is sort of offensive, that it's laser surgery for the tumors in society we want to remove, those tumors being people. The system in place was to come up with a numerical algorithm of sorts. So really, it's just simple math of risk factors and identify the individuals who had the highest numbers and police them more, watch them more, connect with them more. So you might get a score, a high score if you had a conviction, or you were on probation or parole, or you were associated with a gang of some sort. That was kind of fuzzy and didn't work too well. But another way you could get it is if police contacted you. So for every time police contacted you, you got an extra point that raised your risk score, which if you think about it means that police could raise people's risk scores by just contacting them. And if their decision was to, if they were told, go find the people with the highest scores, well, those people are always going to have the highest scores because you keep talking to them. Clearly, it seems like a flawed system, but this was the governing situation in Los Angeles before the critique started to say, what are you doing? Why would we trust you in this situation where you're literally coming up with a list of high-risk people that you're kind of the reason for doing that? Same thing in Chicago. Chicago had what was notoriously known as the heat list, the hot list of individuals who were, again, algorithmically determined to be more at risk for violence, either as the perpetrator of a crime or actually as the victim of the crime. They didn't separate it out. And if you made this sort of heat list, you had a high enough number, police would literally knock on your door and say, hey, we looked you up and you have this high risk score. We want to let you know you're in danger, or you might be in danger of hurting someone. We're watching you. Complete surveillance, complete sort of a way of thinking about it. And again, as it was studied, as it was examined, it said, one, it really wasn't working. All of the audits that eventually were done by the Inspector General showed that didn't work. They were sort of holding things out that they could sort of evaluate your risk for like 18 months, which is really a long time for whether or not you might do something. It's hard for police to respond. They didn't actually help police respond to the actual people. And all of these, again, were ideas of surveillance tactics that were ill-informed, perhaps at the outset, but had real impact on individuals. And of course, who was getting caught up in this? Black, brown, poor men, primarily, who were identified and targeted with additional police surveillance power in ways that were obviously harmful to those people and didn't actually have any impact on crime that they could point to. So, word on trust, maybe not the best sort of framing lens for how we think about police technologies. What about traps? So traps obviously builds off the trust lens, which is essentially like, it's all a trap. You might be pitching this technology as it being more efficient or objective or doing something with data, but the reality is it's going to trap the same individuals in your graphs. It's going to trap poor, black, brown men in certain communities over others. And that's been the history of policing in America. And changing technologies isn't going to change the fundamental problem, because the problem, this is again the trap lens, is policing, not necessarily the technologies that enable policing. And so I use the trap lens to sort of separate out from the pure abolitionist theory, because who am I to speak for abolitionists? They can speak for themselves. But the idea is that there was and is a framework for evaluating surveillance that basically says we will allow for no use of new policing surveillance technologies, because anything that we allow will be misused. How do we know that? Well, the history of American policing kind of shows us that. And you can't show us any counterexamples where it hasn't been misused, which is honestly somewhat true and troubling in its way. So the trap lens says, okay, we have this concern, and they've had some dramatic effects in positive ways. There has been a movement to abolish surveillance that sort of goes along with like defund policing, defund surveillance. In some ways, the surveillance angle is more politically easy to sell because it's one aspect of the larger policing context. It seems easier to say, well, we don't want facial recognition, we don't want these kinds of technologies, as opposed to we don't want policing at all. So there's been some success there. There have been sort of internal sort of corporate responses to this community outrage that basically says, okay, we're not going to sell facial recognition to police. And we've seen that with some companies, Microsoft and Amazon and IBM stepped up and said they weren't going to do that temporarily. We'll see what happens if they continue it. But they said that because of this political pressure, because of the trap lens rhetoric that pushed companies to step back and say, all right, maybe we don't want to do this. We've seen academic theories. Professor Rua Benjamin, who wrote the new Jim Crow, talked about the new Jim Code, this idea of like the new Jim Crow, but using algorithmic bias and algorithm racism within our policing technologies, has been a wonderful advocate for sort of creating the theoretical framework to push back on the trust lens. And then we've actually seen in a handful of very progressive jurisdictions like San Francisco and Berkeley and Seattle, legislative restrictions on certain surveillance technologies. Not everywhere, certainly not everywhere, but some places there has been a movement. So the trap lens has had some benefits, some positive movements, but they've also had some issues. And one issue is like the trap lens is intellectually consistent as long as you want to ban policing. But if you say, well, we might need police, I can't go to abolition completely, and we don't necessarily want to forbid police from having any technology, well, then you got to start drawing lines. You got to have someone who's saying, well, what kind of technologies? What's acceptable? What's not acceptable? And then we sort of move into what we'll get to in the technocratic lens. You got to regulate it. And that's some of the problems. Like once you move from an abolitionist frame of no technology and no policing, it gets really hard to figure out what the rules should be without giving police the power of technology. And if you're against that, then that's a problem. The also reality is that sometimes the sort of critiques are misaligned. Sometimes we see sort of critiques against technology that seem scarier than they are. Sometimes they seem more racist than they are. Sometimes they still are kind of racist because policing has a racial bias element to it. But again, you may have a sort of misaligned thing. And I talk about that in the article, which you're free to read. All right, third thing is our technocratic lens. Technocratic lens says, hey, wait a minute. So we get that trust might not be the optimal thing. We might not be willing to go all the way to abolition, but what if we just regulated? What if we were smart at the front end? We had sort of democratic accountability in the front end. And in many ways, this makes a lot of sense. Most of the errors of the first generation of police technologies were filled with errors because the people running them really hadn't thought through the problems. You talk to the people who ran the LAPD laser program, like, so why did you think adding a point to the every time the police contacted the person would be a smart idea? And they're like, yeah, we just didn't think about that. You're right. Doesn't really make sense. I mean, but they were running the show. They didn't think about it. Same thing goes on with a lot of these technologies, like the fact that, facial recognition was normed primarily on white men. So it does a terrible job of picking up anyone who's not a pale white man, is a problem. And if it hadn't been for like wonderful scholars from MIT and other places that critiqued the use of facial recognition in policing, we would still be trusting it in ways we should. And so the thought is, well, maybe there's a way to, on the front end, deal with these mistakes. And also, it kind of fits like into our democratic theory that we'd want some sort of accountability by the community before we roll out these technologies. Shouldn't the legislature know what's going on before we run with it? And so the technocratic lens, has some powerful arguments to it. We've seen successes. There is a ACLU-led a national project that focuses on what's called CCOPS, Community Control of Police Surveillance, that basically says, look, before you roll out any technology, you gotta have a system in place, legislatively designed, that deals with the problems that we've seen from the trust lines. We have, and there are about 16 jurisdictions, maybe more now, that are considering this sort of approach to, again, front-end accountability. We have seen community oversight boards, like in Oakland. Oakland has a privacy board where before a new technology is used or allowed to be used, they have to go to this community group and say, hey, we'd really like to use automated license plate readers. Here's our policy. Here's where your concerns are. Here's how we're addressing our concerns. If they don't get the blessing, they can't necessarily move forward. There's been some conflict there because the police haven't been very cooperative. But in theory, it's the kind of idea that you'd want where you would have this kind of democratic, localized democratic accountability before you roll out the technology. Independent audits. The reason why the predictive policing technologies in LA and Chicago shut down was because we had audits where people actually looked at what was going on, and they looked at the inputs and the outputs, and they saw the racial bias in both, and they looked at the gaps and what wasn't being covered, and even some of the resource allocation of why we're choosing to go after these crimes, not these crimes, all created the recognition that we probably should have thought about this on the front end, and we hadn't. So maybe we should do it. You also find inspector general reports within the government and sort of external like clinics. There's some legal clinics like in Berkeley and other places that have done some great work trying to pull apart the technologies as they're being used. But I started out as a technocrat. I thought this was the way forward, but the more I sort of study it, the more I sort of have been listening to sort of the abolition side, I realized, the mistakes of the technocrats are that it just doesn't work. You can't point to a place where it's actually worked, which should say something. The structural power balance is imbalanced. We're talking about tech companies, many of them with really deep pockets. We're talking about policing agencies, many of them with really deep pockets. And we don't have a countervailing sort of structural power to respond to that. Any regulation reifies the fact that technology is in place, right? So one of the concerns about facial recognition is like, you can regulate facial recognition for police use. That means you're okay with facial recognition with police use, and some people aren't okay with that. So regulation in some ways sanitizes the use of technologies, which some people might have first principle objections to, which leads to some of the problems. Almost all the technocrats come from a place of high education, privilege, and really are not always the people being policed. And so while, of course, their voices are important, they're not necessarily speaking for the people who are being policed. And there's a gap of voices. There's a gap of representation, and there's an abundance of privilege that's coming into this technocratic way. Also, democracy isn't so democratic. Like the people who vote in local community things tend to be like people with some political power, right? And you're talking about who is like has the ear of the city council. So a lot of times it's like business interests and small businesses and those kinds of folks who might be more willing to have cameras everywhere to protect their business and care less about the individuals who are going to be the subjects, the people who will be on those cameras and surveilled as they go forward. So there's an interesting conflict about like how democratic democracy is and who still will be policed. And finally, we have 18,000 law enforcement agencies in America, each one of them that has the capacity to pull out some new surveillance technology. Who has the capacity who can do it consistently, the cost, the complexity, all of these things are real issues that make it very hard for police to be policed, for the technocrats to sort of stay ahead of what is happening. And so in many ways, I found the technocratic lens to be unsatisfying. It doesn't work for me. There are too many failures and too many gaps in practice and maybe even in theory. So what do we do? What do we do when faced with technologies? And again, doing nothing is doing something, like we've seen in facial recognition, because it'll keep going forward. How do we approach the new technologies, recognizing that we probably need to do something, but we recognize these challenges there? And so when I was writing this paper, it was literally at the moment where there were protests on the streets because of the murder of George Floyd. There were people who were speaking the abolitionist thought, and there was also a recognition that police need to be updated in the 21st century. I mean, you know, they need technology, and what are they going to do? And so my way forward, or my thought forward, was to think about, well, how and where in our past have we tried to wrestle with a similar problem? And so my solution, which is only a theoretical solution, is to think about this as what I call the Tyrant Test. And the Tyrant Test is that you should assume that the technology that you are giving approval to will be misused. And it'll be misused against people you care about. And you need to begin with the assumption that this superpower will be misused like all the movies you've seen. And begin from there. And what are the structures that you would put in place, knowing that there are real dangers with technology? And where else have we been in our sort of lives, our worlds, where we've seen this? And where I came back to was, there is a place where we were really worried about the tyrant, and a place that might sort of unify the right and the left who are thinking about this. And one place is the Constitution. The founding of America was built on a fear of tyranny and a fear of surveillance. And the tyrant was a real tyrant that we were worried about. And we were worried about not just sort of replicating the British tyrant that was an actual tyrant, but also that the federal government we were empowering might very well take over that power and use it against citizens like we're afraid of. And so we built a system of checks and balances. We built sort of a theory of political response to tyrannical power. And this article sort of plays around with this idea of tyranny and surveillance and the Fourth Amendment as a response to a world of new technologies that are threatening liberty, threatening security, and changing sort of the privacy and power of citizens in the United States. And so the argument is that this Tyrant Test lens is a better way to begin the debate. It doesn't solve the problem, but allows the conversation to go forward, past abolition, past just trust us, past the technocratic response, because it's doing something sort of at a deeper level, at a more structural level. And it sort of builds on the article. You can read it. It builds on, recognition, like there really was a concern of tyranny at the time of the founding. For rhetorical reasons and other reasons, the founders were definitely going on and on and on about the threat of tyranny. You see it all through their writings and all these places. And part of that tyranny was actually a fear of surveillance, the surveillance of the sedition that they were writing, or the fact that they were avoiding the taxes on the rum, and that they were worried that customs agents were going to come into their house and see the fact that they were avoiding the taxes on their rum. And so this idea of tyranny and surveillance are actually connecting points to the Fourth Amendment, sort of explicit in the founding, but also you see it again after the 14th Amendment, or during the 14th Amendment, Reconstruction Amendments, where the racial tyranny of post-slavery America was filled with stories of stops and seizures, racially dominating surveillance and oppression of people who were both abolitionists, but even post Civil War, trying to do the Reconstruction Amendments. And there is this resonance between race and surveillance and Fourth Amendment searches and seizures that's pretty rich, that shows that another response to the concern about government surveillance, policing surveillance, racialized police surveillance is a response to this idea of tyranny. So what is the Tyrant Test? It's a system like our system of structural checks. You need to have executive branch checks. You need to be able to have like written policies, got to write it down. You have to have audits and internal systems. You need to have legislative checks. In some ways, everything is sort of in the Tyrant Test is a legislative response. All of this must be all technologies must be given actual authorization. You can't like run up, use facial recognition if the legislative branch in your area, your city council, your state, whatever it is, hasn't given you explicit power to use these technologies. And within that, you have to build in systems of structure of accountability, and maybe those would be audits, maybe those would be front end sort of evaluations and policies, and a lot of the work has been done that sort of grants this sort of democratic authorization. You need to have judicial checks. Why do we have a warrant requirement in the Fourth Amendment? Why? Because we want some independent entity in the judicial branch to be able to say, oh, before you're going to go invade that person's liberty, security, privacy, yeah, you need to have my permission too, because we don't want you to have this arbitrary power that you can use. And much of surveillance in today's age is an arbitrary power. And so just as the same way we have a warrant requirement, a legislative warrant requirement for wiretaps, like right now, if police want to listen to your calls on your phone, they can do that. They just have to go to a judge and get a wiretap act warrant to do it. Again, it's not that they can't do it. They can invade your privacy in pretty grave ways, but they have to go to a judge to get approval. And they have to be able to say, look, there's no other way we could have gotten it. There are minimization requirements that will also for listening to your kids and other things that are non-focused on what they're focused on. We're protected against that. All of those things come up and are there as part of this sort of judicial check that's built and part of the Tyrant Test. Rights-based checks, if your rights are violated, and we're presuming they will be. If history proves anything, it shows that they will be, well then, there should be a rights-based remedy to be able to go to court and say, look, you violated my rights, you violated the policy, you violated the law, I want remedies. And you have to take away some of the standing issues, you have to take away some of the roadblocks that the courts have already put up, but there's no reason why you couldn't build that into a legislative framework to be able to do it. I have this whole series of arguments in the article about local participatory checks, this idea that we need things like juries and grand juries to step in and play a bigger role. At the time of the founding, grand juries were doing things that we wouldn't even think about them doing now. They were doing tax levies, they were investigating on their own, they were essentially a quasi-government entity that was looking to check the government because it was essentially a concern that the government might be overreaching. There's no reason why you couldn't have a local participatory entity that would evaluate surveillance technologies, just like Oakland, but perhaps built into a system of structure. So again, if in your neighborhood, they want to roll out smart streetlights, in my Tyrant Test world, they have to go to this local participatory board, get approval, and it may be okay in your neighborhood and not in another neighborhood. It may be okay there. And if you're concerned about that as being chaotic, well, that was kind of the world of the founding. It was sort of localized. It was sort of democratic at a local level. And maybe that's okay, that you're okay with, invasive technologies, and maybe some people aren't. And finally, race has to be a part of this. This is all like policing in America is largely about race. And you need to think about race as you are building this Tyrant Test, because the tyranny isn't equal and the surveillance isn't equal. And you need to build in sort of equal protection audits and other systems to be able to protect against this. Again, so the Tyrant Test is an all of the above approach. It sort of takes in all of the pieces that we've seen, some legislative, borrowed from the technocratic thing, some abolitionist in its almost ways, because it is pretty restrictive. And it tries to build in a sort of structural response to this question of, well, what do we do with these superpowers? I also have, I don't want to spend too much time on, some substantive elements. If you go back into the Fourth Amendment and see what the founders were concerned about, they were actually concerned with, even with legal process, even with the warrant, we still don't want you reading our papers. We still do not want the government to be able to go in and rummage through our papers. And we have forgotten that or sort of moved away from that, because sometimes our papers are pretty incriminating and sometimes we want law enforcement to have it. But if you go back to what the concern was, there really was a concern that maybe that certain things should be just carved out on substantive grounds. And we've lost that legally, but sort of in the Tyrant Test, I sort of build that back in. And I try to say that what the Tyrant Test is this sort of first principles approach. It is a way to say, hey, you on the right, you on the left, you in the center, there are ways to move forward with these scary technologies, but they are restrictive. And of course, that means everyone's going to critique it, right? On the right, they say, look, or on the law enforcement, say, look, this is too onerous. We'll never be able to have any technologies that we want to have. And right now we don't have any rules, so this is really onerous. And they're right, it is really onerous. It really begins with a distrust of policing and police use of surveillance. On the abolitionist side, I said, look, if you give any ground, if you allow this at all, it's just going to be a slippery slope into dystopia. And even a very well-regulated dystopia is still a dystopia, and we would rather not have that. So there'll be a critique there. There'll be substantive critiques about, using the metaphor of the Constitution, which is a pretty unequal document, or the Fourth Amendment, which has in practice not proved to be terribly protective. All legitimate criticisms that I address in the paper, although they're still legitimate criticisms, it's hard to address them. But that shows that maybe if you're looking for these first principles, maybe if you're looking for a way forward, there is something in our history and our sort of sense of approaching power and police power, law enforcement power, government power that we can look to move us forward. And so that's the theory of the Tyrant Test. I was told to talk about 45 minutes. I think I just hit that. And so I'm happy to take your questions and your thoughts and your concerns and engage if you have any. And I thank you for your time and this opportunity. And I hope you, if you have a chance to enjoy the paper or share it around. And it's been an honor to talk to you. And I look forward to any questions or concerns you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson. We can take questions either in the question and answer spot there at the bottom, or you could put them in the chat.
See, in law school, I could just cold call people. I was like, you in the back. I would, what do you think? That's the beauty of being a law professor. You can always, just see someone gives, they twitch their eyes. You're like, well, you have a thought, don't you? Why don't you share that? So maybe I can do that virtually.
Let's see. I don't see any yet. I actually have a question, so I'll jump in. Sometimes it takes people a few minutes to type in their chat in the chat there. But I found it interesting that you pointed to the wiretap thing and the way that we restrict the wiretap. And that's a type of technology, right? Prior to having that, what was the history of the restrictions on that? Like, did the technology come up and then police were using it rampantly the way they're using surveillance now? And then there were lawsuits which then put in place restrictions, or were the restrictions done at the front end?
So it's a great question, and it actually deals with a lot of the history of the Fourth Amendment that for a while was really focused on sort of physical intrusions and didn't incorporate sort of things that were not, think about the language of the Fourth Amendment, like your persons, your effects, your papers, or your property, right? Your home. And there was a famous case called Olmstead in 1928 that basically said, look, a wiretap isn't a Fourth Amendment issue because it's not a thing. It's not a wiretap. It's not a person. It's not a home. It's not a paper. It's not an effect. So, it doesn't fit. And so in 1967, the Supreme Court decided this case called Katz v. United States. Famous case because it gives us the still existing test for whether or not there's a search for Fourth Amendment purposes, which is basically whether or not that police act violates an expectation of privacy. And what Charlie Katz, the named guy in Katz, was doing was he was making illegal betting calls from a payphone. For young people out there, we used to have to go to a payphone and put in a quarter or nickel at that time to make a phone call. We didn't have one in our pockets. But the FBI put literally a cassette tape on top and pressed play and recorded his illegal bets. And in doing so, the Supreme Court had to wrestle with, well, does the Fourth Amendment apply to this? It's not, it's a payphone. It's not like his home. It's not his effect. It's not his person. But the court decided to move into the modern world and say, yes, it does. Because, and this is the test that we still apply and I still teach today, that it violates an expectation of privacy that Charlie Katz subjectively held, but also something that objectively we think is reasonable. So after Katz comes down, and now the government is required to get a warrant, Congress gets involved. And Congress says, we're actually worried about the sort of wiretap issues, and we're going to pass legislation in the congressional record and the rest of Congress that says, in order to use this technology, which again was then a new technology, you have to do a couple of things. One, you have to demonstrate to a judge there's no other way to get this information. So if you're literally going to listen into someone's like personal calls, you have to explain there's no other way to get it. You have to explain that there's sort of probable cause, that there's a crime. That's why you're doing it. You're not just listening to someone's conversation. You have to have minimization requirements, meaning that, if other people are using the phone, again, this is an old school world where you literally had a phone that plugs into the wall and everyone can use that phone. You can't record and use the conversations of like the kids or the spouse or whatever. You can only use the tape recordings of the mafia don that you're using this for. And it was restrictive in this way, right? I mean, you only used it, and police only still use it for more, serious crimes. It wasn't just like we're going to wiretap everyone to do it. And it's actually a good model for some of these new technologies. In a paper I wrote on facial recognition, I say actually facial recognition is again a place where you could write a statutory requirement to do essentially a wiretap act like a request, where you go to a judge and say, hey, judge, I need you to do this facial recognition match because, hey, we had a bank robbery and we have an image of the bank robber. And we think that his image is going to be in this sort of, DMV driver's license database. We have no other way of getting it. We're just going to use it for this case. Can we do that? I think honestly, a judge would be like, yep, you can do that. That seems to make perfect sense. You got a crime, you got a suspect, you can do your matching. We're okay with that. And that sort of judicial thinking is not always a part of these surveillance technologies that largely sort of step away and avoid some of the sort of traditional requirements of that. So we've had it because it was like part and parcel of our sort of history of the Fourth Amendment. And my hope is that facial recognition would be another moment. In fact, I've suggested this to Congress, that they should pass an equivalent, based on the Wiretap Act, but for things like facial recognition, surveillance, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Okay, we do have a couple questions here. I'm going to go first to the Q&A. Caleb Williams have asked, have timeframes played any role in the retention of data for analysis?
So they should, although it's hard to find a place where it is. So one of the issues of the time machine problem, like the ability that you can collect a person's movements, or the Baltimore surveillance planes that are collecting that, you might feel more reassured if like they weren't, the police weren't keeping it for very long. And so there was some internal guidance in Baltimore where they only kept it for 45 days unless there was an ongoing case, and they keep it for long. So maybe that's okay. They're waiting if there was a crime and they'd use it. If not, it would go away. So maybe you feel sort of comfortable. Time plays a role in some of the Supreme Court's tracking cases. There's a case called United States versus Jones, which involved a GPS device that was tracked on a car for 28 days. And 5 justices of the court said, well, 28 days seems pretty long because you can pretty much figure out a lot of the inferences of where someone might be going, what they're doing, whether they're going to like a health clinic, whether they're going to a church, whether they're going to a school, if you watch them for 28 days. For cell site location data, like again, another tracking technology, the Supreme Court said, well, 7 days seems pretty invasive to us. And so we'll call that as well. But there's no like firm line. And one of the hard questions for legislatures or any entity that's trying to think about what the technology should be limited to is to figure out what is that time. Maybe it should just be 24 hours. If there hasn't been a crime and you don't need it, destroy it. And that might, if you're thinking about a technocratic response, that actually might be a line you're okay with. But someone has to make that call, and there aren't, firm lines about where that call is.
Okay, we have another comment in the chat saying they enjoyed this. They didn't know anything about technology that the police are using in their local community, but they do think that technology should be a choice that the community decides on due to privacy issues. That's kind of interesting whether you could, and there's a related question I'll get to, whether some communities might choose and others might not. Does that set up sort of some inequality, or is that a possibility? I mean, obviously it's happening now. Some are using it, some are not.
Yeah, so I am on the firm belief that that technology should be localized, even though technology doesn't want to be localized, right? If you're building a network system of smart street cameras, you kind of want them everywhere. You don't want to have gaps in particular places. But if I'm living in that area, I want to have some kind of say in it. And I think what we've seen, unfortunately, is that because we haven't had a sort of a community up approach to these technologies, we have had sort of people from above deciding, like, look, this is a high crime area. This is a poor community. So we're going to put in our streetlights. If you look at where the streetlight cameras are in like Detroit, it tends to correlate with poor areas. Like, where did they first do the Baltimore Plains? Eventually they're doing the whole city. But they started doing like West Baltimore, which is like the poor African-American communities. And again, like, if it's left up to sort of the police without sort of a democratic conversation or even community conversation, largely it will be unequal in that certain communities will be over-policed and other communities will be under-policed. What's interesting about that, of course, is it might actually flip if you gave it into localized communities. One of the things you've seen is that certain kind of like gated communities or communities that are trying to exclude the other, like richer affluent communities, are buying their own sort of automated license plate readers. Automated license plate readers are literally automated cameras that record the license plates of cars that go past. And so police use it to see if there's like a stolen car. But these sort of affluent sort of enclaves have decided to put it in their neighborhoods so they can see what cars are coming in. And if a car that isn't one of their sort of listed cars in the neighborhood comes in, there's an immediate alert. And you can imagine, of course, how that can be used to sort of police people from coming into your community, sort of exclude it with technology. There's a whole race element to it that clearly is a part of what's going on here. And so in some ways, localizing the determination of who gets to control the technology might have some really sort of unintended and or negative consequences. On the other hand, if you're a community that says, hey, we really don't want facial recognition in our neighborhoods, we really don't trust the police and don't want the police there, like there should be a place for that voice to come up. And right now there isn't one. A, because we don't have legislative sort of oversight, but B, because there's no one really focusing, except for protesters, people are protesting, but no one's really focusing on encouraging the community to step up and say, like, no in our communities. We don't want this in our communities. And having that conversation going forward. And I don't want to say no one, because there are people. There are people in Los Angeles, there are people in Chicago, and there's some great activists who are pushing it. But if you're thinking nationally across the wide stretch of America, not enough people.
Mm-hmm. Good. Another comment and question. Fantastic talk. How do we fairly balance differences in crime rates among different communities or populations as discriminators for how we use these technologies? This is kind of related. It's
a good question, right? So, if one of the technologies we talked about was predictive policing, right? And the predictive policing is basically, we'll take, you can take crime data about individuals, or you can take crime data about people. Or places, and then sort of direct resources based on what the crime data says. Now, there are a lot of questions with that, right? Well, what kind of crime are you counting? Are you only counting the crimes that you can see? Because a lot of crime is unreported. All sorts of problems with sort of the data that's going into it. But generally, if you're sort of looking at crime rates and you're a police department who's asked to respond to crime rates, where you direct your resources is going to correlate there. And so many times the way these technologies have worked is that they are put in poor areas and areas of higher crime. So ShotSpotter is a good example, right? One of the critiques in Chicago about where the sensors are in Chicago is they tend to be in poor areas of crime. And the police response is like, well, that's where the shootings are. And that's where we want them. Like, we could put them in like an affluent community where there hasn't been a shooting in 10 years, but that's sort of a waste of resources, even if it's fairer. We want it where the gunshots are going. And that's a hard question, right? Because it means that there is inequality in the provision of surveillance, which will mean inequality in the use of sort of police response and force. And some community members might say, that's a great thing. I want police to come to me. And some community members are like, no, we have too much police here already, and it's not making me any safer. So please don't add in a new sort of reason for police to come here when they hear a firecracker or where they hear, some other loud noise that may or may not be a gunshot, which occasionally happens with ShotSpotter.
Okay. Caleb Williams said, I have had an assignment recently to write on the ethics of AI surveillance in a retail context to prevent or detect theft. Has the ACLU or other civil rights groups provided any positive or negative views on these technologies in commercial settings?
So it's a great question. The ACLU probably isn't going to be the ones who necessarily are leading on, although they've been pretty good, in part because the ACLU is primarily focused on government power as opposed to private power. Now, that line is actually kind of a false line when we're talking about commercial surveillance. If you want to know one of the most surveilled places in the world, it's your like neighborhood Target. Target has the best surveillance technologies, as does like Walmart and place. Like they literally have more sophisticated forensic video systems than most police, except for the FBI, most police departments. And they can, you know, when I was a public defender, and this was even many years ago, you could go to a Giant and, you know, the Giant foodstuffs, and they literally could read the time on a guy's watch. It was that good to be able to watch the surveillance there. So what has happened since that was many years ago is that, as you referenced in your question, well, now there's AI pattern matching that's going on in these technologies. So imagine you're in a Target, imagine that there are cameras everywhere, and that the cameras are programmed using video analytics and object recognition to look for suspicious activities. And so what they might say to the computer is, all right, look for someone like tucking in their shirt, or maybe putting something like down their pants, if that's part of the shoplifting problem, or putting something in their pocket. And the automated AI system will cue the observer who's probably watching a series of cameras to this pattern. Like it's been taught to look at a pattern, it sees a pattern, then they rewind the tape, they see, oh, yep, he is putting, you know, Advil in his pocket, that's a shoplifting, let's go get him and stop him. And those kinds of things are growing. And so there is a critique about sort of the use of technologies, because in many ways, the technologies are driving the suspicion of shoplifters or other people in these commercial settings. There can be AI facial recognition lists that are put in these systems that are largely unregulated. So there was sort of a story that went around in DC and Georgetown where a bunch of high-end retailers who were retailing like jewelry and stuff had their own list of people they thought were involved in jewelry thefts, I guess. And so they had trained their facial recognition to like find these people. And occasionally you get it wrong, right? Because facial recognition gets it wrong, especially when people are trying to hide their appearance and change their appearance and everything else. And so we have sort of in many ways outsourced private enforcers of law enforcement to these companies because they're trying to protect their goods, but done so in a largely unregulated way. And it's really hard, just because your question, really hard to regulate it. Why? Because for the most part, people can do what they want to do in their own property, right? There isn't a rule that says don't use facial recognition. There isn't a rule that says don't hire your own security guards or build forensic science labs. Like we could check the government through sort of legislative oversight, and because it's a government, but it's very hard to do that in consumer goods. And we're going to see this even more, right? As I don't know if you seen the Amazon stores. And even saw the Silent Live skit last Saturday about Amazon stores and races. It's really a funny thing where basically the new Amazon store is completely cashless. Like you just walk in, the Amazon has your information, they have your biometrics, they have your credit card on their system, and you just put the stuff in your pockets and take it, and they can record it. And like that's the system. And the Silent Live skit is talking about sort of the racial element of this, where people are like, it's a trap. Like I'm not doing this because this is scary, and I don't believe that this is the way it would work. And it's a wonderful satire of the reality of technology, AI, race, racial injustice, policing in America that works because of the fact of that we are moving to this AI world where the person who will determine whether that person is a thief or just a consumer is a computer program that hasn't really been checked or opened up in the public and hasn't been democratically approved of and hasn't been audited, and really is going to have a bad impact when some person is going to be misidentified or the algorithm is going to go haywire and they're going to get stopped for shoplifting when all they were trying to do is pick up some overpriced food at Whole Foods.
All right, let me just check the chat one more. There's some really nice comments in both the chat and the Q&A. Very positive. Let's see, one more new message. A lot of thank yous. I think I got all the questions. Let me just check.
Thank you all for coming.
Well, let's thank Dr. Ferguson one more time. Thanks so much for coming. I wish it was face-to-face, as I said, but we are really pleased that you made it with us virtually. And to everybody else, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and join us back in April for our last talk in the series. That's on April 19th, and it's with Dr. Craig Watkins for a talk entitled Designing Artificial Intelligence for Racial Justice. Thank you all. Thanks again, Dr. Ferguson.
Thank you, everyone.